Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about some pretty interesting stuff that I really haven't talked about too much on my channel, although I have tweeted about this particular topic after watching some videos by the exorcist called Chad Ripperger. Now, Chad Ripperger was ordained back in 1997 and he started performing exorcisms in 2007. He has quite a bit of education and he's very knowledgeable and he's very well known in the Christian community, particularly the Catholic Christian community. As I indicated, he's a priest. And I tweeted something that I had learned from Father Ripperger. And interestingly enough, here it is on this channel. So I was listening to this debate when all of a sudden I hear the words about a tweet that I put out there. And you can see this debate was between Cliffe Knechtle, who is a Christian, and he's also a pastor. I looked him up. It looks like he works at a church called Grace Community Church. I couldn't tell much about the church. It looks like it's non-denominational. And he did not agree at all with my tweet and references to something that Father Ripperger said. So he didn't agree to that at all. In fact, he seemed like he got a little angry when Matt asked him about it. But that brings up some of the crux of Matt's argument. And Matt's kind of a famous YouTuber and atheist. Matt's big argument against Christianity is that there are so many different denominations of Christianity. How do you know which ones are true? And I've heard that argument so many times that it drove me from my Baptist faith, which I had been entertaining for around 10 years, back to my original faith of Catholicism. So thanks to Matt and others who have argued similarly, I decided to trace the roots, see if there was the original church. And that led me back to the Rock of Peter. On this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail. And anything you bind will be bound here. Anything you loose will be loosed, going back to Isaiah. So Peter, of course, was buried at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Vatican, and that forms the foundation of the Christian faith, which speaks to Catholicism. But I digress. I want to go ahead and play this little nugget from this video. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence that is provided for Jesus' resurrection from Cliffe. I think Cliffe did go back to the early church fathers like Ignatius of Antioch, and he went back to Clement of Rome. And I would like to add a little bit to what Cliffe says here. But before I do that, let's go back to the 4 generals from hell. You were wondering what Father Ripperger said. Yes, he has indicated that there are these 4 generals in hell. And before I get there, I want to say hi to people. I've got a captive desk here and Slam RN, and I saw Harry Stark earlier and Shiami. So it's very good to see you. So here we go. Let's let her roar. So Matt thinks he's got something on Cliffe because he thinks that this is very strange, that I believe that there are principalities in hell. Now, let me preface this. Please read Ephesians 6 if you don't think that the Bible supports the idea of principalities, meaning a different authority structure in hell. So here we go.
For example, and I promise I'm not just doing this for fun, and I'm not trying to saddle Cliffe with somebody else's views on God. But this week, because it amused me and it confused me, I'm going to share a tweet from someone who may in fact be watching. The tweet reads, "My Christian beliefs point to the 5 generals running hell: Baal, impurity; Lilith, female lesbianism; Asmodeus, sodomy; Baphomet, child sacrifice, worship, abortion, killing innocent offspring; and Leviathan, female homosexuality." Now, this individual, despite the fact that this is not expressly covered in the Bible in any way, believes that they understand that hell is real, that hell has an organizational structure, that organizational structure has 5 generals, which are somehow responsible for various sins. And this individual seems to think that female lesbianism and perhaps female homosexuality are 2 different sins. And I don't know what female lesbianism is versus male lesbianism, but the 5 ones that they go through tell us much more about this individual's psyche and what they think than anything about a real hell. And yet there are countless people sitting in churches, once again, not saddling Cliffe with this. What we need to do is figure out, how is it that this person thinks they know the specifics of hell and hell's structure and sin? And what makes them right or wrong compared to Cliffe's model? Does Cliffe think that these are the 5 generals of hell and what they are? And if not, how does this become a part of Christianity for a person? Because while Cliffe and I disagree on Christianity, I also disagree with the individual who made that tweet about the makeup of hell.
So let's clarify a little bit here. Lilith is also referenced in the Bible in Isaiah 34:19 as the night monster. So Lilith is the one who represents female or feminine lesbianism. That's female to female lesbianism. Leviathan is the one that represents the more masculine version of homosexuality between women. And as Father Ripperger says, they're a little heavy on the heels. And I'm going to play what Father Ripperger says so you can see that behind that. Leviathan is represented as the serpent monster in the sea. You can find him in Psalms 74:14, 104:26, Isaiah 27:1, and Job 41. Asmodeus is the evil spirit. You can find Asmodeus in Tobit, and Asmodeus is the god of male homosexuality and sodomy. And Baal is, of course, the enemy that's referenced many, many times in the Old Testament. People were sacrificing their children to Baal, and you can find him in Jeremiah 7:9, 11:13, 19:4-6, Romans 11:4, 1 Kings 18:18-22, Numbers 25:3, and more. There's many, many references to Baal. And then Baphomet is more of a new one that's not referenced in the Bible, but Baphomet is the one that you can find, in fact, the people have found this little mirror that was put up at Christmas time and advertised in the White House that has an image of Baphomet, which is a goat's head. And of course, you can remember the difference between the sheep and the goats as referenced in the Bible. But Baphomet is for child sacrifice. And so that's the idea of abortion. And Father Ripperger is going to trace the history back from the 1960s in how these demons have secured some power in the United States. So let me go ahead and turn it over so you can see where I got this idea, because this is not my original idea by any stretch of the imagination. This comes from someone else. And so I'm going to play what Father Ripperger says. I think you'll find it truly fascinating. Now, if you think that this is completely unbiblical, you're not listening to the fact that there is a Bible authoritarian structure that is referenced. And so let's go to that. Here we go. And I'm going to get back to the debate between Matt in just a moment. So let's listen to where I came up with these ideas.
I want you to listen to a small clip from Father Chad Ripperger, who's an exorcist, who gives us the history of the sexual revolution and how it fell upon us. Mr. Engineer, can you play the clip?
Underneath Satan, there are what we call the 5 generals. The 5 generals are the 5 demons that are immediately hierarchically underneath Satan, and they are the ones who execute his plans. In some cases, they call it the table, because it's basically they get to divide up certain things. The first demon under him is Baal. Baal, now, Satan actually is the demon of impurity, but Baal is a demon of impurity. His principal function is to get cultures to succumb to impurity, primarily through fornication. Once the fornication sets in, then what happens is that the perspective that the conjugal act is ordered towards children is lost. From that arises the idea that sex should be recreational and that you can use it for any way you get pleasure, that's fine. So Baal lays the groundwork. We saw this in our own country. It was called the free love movement. He lays the groundwork. The next thing he tries to do is, although in our country he managed to pull something off that was rather extraordinary. The next thing is after that, as we read from St. Paul, God delivers men and women up to their lusts, and men will start to want to sleep with men and women with women, which basically means what? Once the spirit of fornication sets in, which, by the way, I don't know if you noticed, in the New Rite, they removed this from the spirit of fornication, deliver us from the litany of saints, at the very time that the free love movement gained ascendancy. What we pray for is what we get. You don't pray for it, you're not going to get it. After that, then what happens is the culture, the next 3 demons show up. The first is Asmodeus. He's the demon of homosexuality in men. Then there's the demon of Leviathan, which is the demon of homosexuality in men, but of the masculine kind. These are the women who are heavy on the heels, we would say. Okay. Then there is the spirit of Lilith, which is the more seductive form of female homosexuality. After those have gained ascendancy in a culture, which, by the way, if you look at the cultures, every single culture is pushed in this direction. Okay. So historically, not just ours, but historically, this is always the progression. Once you have fornication, you end up with contraception, and then the upshot of that is homosexuality and then abortion. Baphomet is the fifth one, and he's the demon of child sacrifice, abortion. In our culture, think of this. They shot down the fornication laws, and so they delivered us into the hands of Baal. Then they had Roe versus Wade and delivered us into the hands of Baphomet. And then they allowed gay marriage, and so now our country politically is in the hold of the top 5 demons in hell other than Satan. They delivered us into their hands. That's where we're at.
And I know that this might be controversial to some of you, but I actually happen to agree with that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring another exorcist in just for an interesting little segue. I was listening to Michael Knowles' channel. And if you're familiar with Michael Knowles' channel, then you know, let me just turn this one off. If you're familiar with Michael Knowles' channel, then you might have heard this one by Father Dan Rehill. He has a very interesting story that he told, and I think you might find it interesting yourself. So let me just bring this in, and I'm going to highlight this portion where he encounters Satan, who had put himself into a male figure. So let's listen to what he has to say here. Make sure we've got it all the way turned up.
Notice we came here to talk about demons. We're spending most of our time talking about God. I guess that's the way it should be.
It's the way it should be.
C.S. Lewis made some point about this. Maybe in Screw Tape, I forget where he said, you have to think about demons enough to know that they exist and to watch out for them. But you shouldn't think about them very much.
You shouldn't. You have to be aware of them. You have to know how to deal with them, which most people don't. What authority you have as a child of God, and you have authority. You have authority over your own person, you have authority over your wife, you have authority over your children. And you can cast things out if they're harassing them. But curiosity is not a virtue. And if you start digging into the occult and the dark world and things like that, you're opening a door. And you might not be strong enough to close it. And then you've invited something into your life that you don't want. And then you have to call me.
Someone wrote into my show, said, Michael, if you could meet the devil. I said, I don't know, I probably have met the devil a few times. Don't wish I
Met him twice.
You've met him twice?
Personally.
How'd that go?
Not well the first time, because I wasn't even a seminarian. I was discerning. I just came out of my life of sin. I joined Our Lady of Victory, like I mentioned, and this little old Polish priest who became my spiritual director. And I remember one day I went in and I said, this job is killing me because, it was a sales position. I was entertaining big shots at all fancy restaurants every night, drinking. I said, I can't balance this with trying to live this new life. It's not working. So he said to me, well, let's do this. Why don't you, for the next month, you can go call ahead or go to meet to the restaurant early and tell the bartender when you order a drink that it would be just club soda, no vodka. But you would order it publicly and then they won't know. I said, I can do that. So he said, no alcohol for a month. So it's the middle of the day. It's like noon. I come out of the church and there's this beautiful, handsome man, custom tailored suit. And he's staring at me, which if you've ever lived in New York, you don't stare at people.
It's pretty unusual.
Very, like you put your eye, you don't,
yeah.
It's almost an attack, like this, I'm being attacked now, I have to fight. And I just was like, weird. So I turned to walk towards my office and he runs up next to me and he grabs me by the arm. Again, no guys do that. no guy grabs somebody by the arm and is like escorting them. And he goes, let's get a drink. And I just had chills go up and down my body. And I said, get away from me. And then I turned direction and went towards my apartment because it was closer. And I got to my apartment and I walked through the doors and the doors closed behind me. And I looked out and he was just laughing at me. And it was like, whew. So he leaves and I run back to the church. I go, Father, let me tell you what just happened. What do you think happened here? What is this? He goes, I told you, you're going to have a target on your back. So you got to be careful. And I said, was that who I think it was? And he goes, sounds like it.
Certainly seems that way.
I mean, that was just no random person for sure. So that really, it's frightened me, to be honest. I was like that. I didn't sign up for this at all. And then a few years later, I was on a vacation visiting an old banker friend down in Miami. And she set up a whole luncheon at this place called Nikki Beach, which really isn't appropriate for seminarians or priests.
Yeah.
It's it's the glitterati, the high-powered, wealthy people. It's bottle service on the beach.
Right.
And I'm just like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. And the two girls to my right, I knew both of them. Sandra was hosting, and my ex-boss, Christine, was with me. And they start looking at this guy across over by the other end of the deck. Like, oh my God, look at that guy. He's so handsome. My God, he's beautiful. And all of a sudden, Sandra's like, oh, he's coming over here. And I turn and I look, and it's him. It's the guy. It's the one that wanted to get the drink. Only now he's like shirtless in a bathing suit, and he walks up and he goes, "What are you doing here? I thought you were going to be a priest." And he goes, "This is my territory. You shouldn't be here." And both the girls got flipped out. They were like, they had the scare mechanism,
Like the face that I'm making right now.
yeah, literally like, danger, Will Robinson. And Christine's like, get the check. And she threw money down. She's like, we're out of here. And we left. But like, when those things happen, God allowed it,
Yeah.
right? So for me, I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. And God was letting me know, you have no place going to places like that anymore. Don't do.
So that's just another little story from an exorcist that I think you might find interesting. And so I'm going to return back now to the debate, and we'll stop that one and head it over to the other. So I hope you enjoyed that one. And here we go. Let's get back to the debate. Here we go. Damn it. There. Okay. So I want to zoom ahead actually to where Cliffe responds to the idea of the 5 generals, and that's right about here.
First of all, I find it ridiculous and amusing, and I figured that you would very easily say, no, I don't buy into the notion that there's 5 generals of hell and 2 of them are responsible for lesbian sex. But what criteria are you going to use to determine the truth of what you call Christianity that would exclude what she thinks it is?
That Twitter that you used was a sad commentary on the stuff that you like to dabble in, Matt. That's scary. That is really scary. You know very well that they're not 5 generals in hell. You've read the Bible. So what on earth? Why would you stoop to that, Matt, and try and use that as a point? I mean, it's ridiculous.
So now you're saying that this tweet is about something that I dabble in. I had nothing to do with this.
You read it.
He's clearly very upset that I was able to put on what Father Ripperger said and what others have confirmed in these exorcisms. The one thing that goes on is the Catholic Church has some very powerful exorcists, and the rights to exorcism haven't been given to a number of people in other denominations, certain other denominations, possibly not in whatever denomination that Cliffe represents. And so he obviously has a hostility towards this, but I do think it's consistent with the principalities that we find in Ephesians 6. So let's get into listening a little bit more, because then he's going to turn into the resurrection here. So let's see what he says about the resurrection.
I've asked for methodology.
I've
asked for
My example of an
methodology,
atheist
and
is
you
not
keep
supposed to
accusing
solve
me
it.
of
My
stooping. If
example of
you're
an
just going to
atheist
be a
is not-
Hold on,
jackass,
just to be
I will
sure that
continue
we-
to
just to
talk
be sure-
Sorry, I didn't realize we were going to see. I forgot about this part. Let me just zoom ahead a little bit so we can get past that little rumble.
What I find-
if you'll with an open mind look at it, You know,
Okay,
people who come
so
close to
now
Christ,
your explanation is that I'm just not doing it with an open mind. Will you ever stop addressing me and what you think of me and actually present evidence for a resurrection?
Fine. The evidence for the resurrection is he really died. And a Roman soldier took a spear and jammed into the
How
side
you know
of
that?
Christ, and an issue of watery serum flowed out separated from the side of Christ. We read in the Gospel of John. He was dead. They took his body off the cross. They anointed it with perfume, wrapped it in burial cloth, and laid it in the tomb, not a secret hideout tomb, a very well-known tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. His disciples dispersed in disillusionment. There was no Passover plot. And 3 days later, he appeared risen from the dead to a group of women. And then over a period of 40 days, he appeared to over 500 people. And those people, many of whom were willing to die for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ.
The 500?
And for the past 2,000 years, people have claimed to have met this Jesus Christ and that he has changed their lives. Preeminent among them would be the Saul of Tarsus, who met Christ on the road to Damascus and had an incredible conversion experience and followed Christ. So there's overwhelming evidence that Christ was dead historically, and historically he rose from the dead.
Is any of that overwhelming evidence that you think you just cited not from the Bible?
Yes, I listed, or you're not listening. I listed the names.
No, sir.
With Clement, Bishop of Antioch, Ignatius.
None of those people are attesting to the truth of anything that you just said.
That's actually completely false. So it's become apparent that Matt hasn't read what some of the early church fathers attested. In fact, Ignatius is one of the rare ones, in fact, the only ancient person that I can see who also confirmed what Matthew said about the dead people coming alive after after his crucifixion. And that was confirmed by Ignatius. In fact, Ignatius and Irenaeus traced just about every major portion of the New Testament in their writings. And you can also find confirmation very early from Justin Martyr and Polycarp and others. And so who are these? Well, Clement of Rome is another one. And he says that some of the people I'm naming aren't contemporary, but they're contemporary to, like, for example, Clement of Rome was the one that Peter laid hands on to become the Bishop of Rome after he was, after he would, give up the role. And Peter, of course, as you know, was crucified upside down, probably. And we know he was martyred for sure, but the crucifixion upside down is something that's been historically noted in the church. But Clement of Rome was around at a very early time, and he wrote, and he was contemporary to the apostles. He was very familiar with Paul and Peter, and Clement is perhaps even mentioned by Paul in the book of Philippians. So he was one of the very early writers who confirmed much in the New Testament. Of course, I don't base an assumption that Matt has that we can't use anything in the New Testament and judge it as historical. Naturally, we have independent sources coming from the New Testament from a number of different authors who all weave together a story that makes a lot of sense in many, many ways. It makes sense spiritually. It goes to explain much of the stuff that goes on in our lives. We understand why we have tribulations, for example. But then let's get to Ignatius. Ignatius was probably born about the year 30. Tradition has said that Ignatius was the young child who sat on Jesus' lap at one point, but that hasn't been confirmed by early writings. But Ignatius was very familiar with John, the Apostle John, who wrote the fourth gospel, and Mother Mary. In fact, Mother Mary corresponded. The only writing you'll see coming from Mother Mary was a letter that she wrote to Ignatius. And Ignatius was martyred around 107 AD. Now, his words were passed down to Polycarp. Polycarp's words were passed down to Irenaeus. There is a succession that comes right there, an apostolic succession. Ignatius very much highlighted the unity of the church, and he was very much against separation. He recognized the Catholic Church and its authority structure, and that the way that we should recognize and appreciate our bishops and the apostolic succession. And so we see a lot of that coming very early. And Irenaeus, if you listen to his books, Irenaeus writes quite a bit that traces the entire New Testament. And so we've got lots of early confirmation outside of the Bible. So let's go on.
Those people are attesting to the fact that people believed those things and made those claims.
Eyewitnesses.
No, sir. Those individuals are not themselves eyewitnesses.
Let's go over who the eyewitnesses were. So we have, of course, Matthew, the tax collector, who makes a lot of unique statements that a tax collector would be making in the first gospel. We also have John, who was the beloved disciple. You remember that John was the one that Jesus gave care of Mary to when Jesus was on the cross. John, as I mentioned, was also a friend of Ignatius, very familiar with Ignatius. And so we've got that eyewitness. Then we have Paul. A lot of people always just want to reference Paul's road to Damascus experience with Jesus, where he saw a bright light that blinded him. But we also know from Acts, later in Acts, that Jesus appeared to Paul and comforted him. And Paul said that the words that he wrote were coming from God. They weren't his own words. So he made that quite clear. And so that Paul could be labeled a third one. Then, of course, Peter. Peter wrote his own books in the Bible, and Peter was the rock upon which Jesus formed his church, one of the most important apostles that Jesus had. And of course, the one who denied him 3 times and embarrassed himself, but he obviously made up for it later. And so we have Peter. And then, of course, we have the Mother Mary. In fact, in her letter to Ignatius, she also highlighted the importance of worshiping in Jesus. And then, of course, we have Jesus's relatives. We have Jude, who also wrote a portion, and James. So we have relatives of Jesus who also, of course, were eyewitnesses. So there are a number of eyewitnesses in the Bible. Now, discounting them merely because they're in the Bible speaks to a bias. You have to think about something. The early church put the books in the Bible from the people who were closest to Jesus, the eyewitnesses. If you were an eyewitness, you were a believer, unless you were denying. I mean, I guess some people did try to deny that, but these people were all in the Bible for an important reason. There's no reason to discount the Bible and its historicity. Some people say, oh, well, the apostles, they made it all up because they were able to get something out of it. Well, what did they get? They didn't get sex. They didn't get money. They didn't get power. They didn't get anything. In fact, Christianity hadn't even been given legal status until the year 313 under Constantine. So they weren't getting anything out of it. They did it out of the honesty within. And they even told embarrassing stories, like the rock that Jesus is going to form his church on was unfortunately a big wimp right around the time when Jesus was being crucified. Now, I can't say I wouldn't have been a wimp too, seeing what the fate Jesus was going through. You might want to note in the Shroud of Turin, which I just did a debate yesterday, the shroud had over 270 marks on it, where you could see that the man in the shroud had been whipped 270 times. And it wasn't just on his back. It was all over his back, his backside, his back legs, his front. It was all over him. His eye was gouged quite a bit. He had a huge mark near his eye, just apparently unrecognizable. And of course, that's in confirmation of what we found out in Isaiah 52 and 53 about the man who was going to be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. So here we go.
That's correct. But they talked to the eyewitnesses.
You have no way of demonstrating that, but hang on. Let's go ahead and assume that Matthew was an eyewitness. How do we know that Matthew is an accurate reporter of the facts that he supposedly witnessed?
First of all,
one way that we know that Matthew is an accurate reporter is because you can take the gospel accounts and they're very reconcilable. They all fit together like a beautiful glove. And Matthew recounted it, and you had a number of people who were among him, who were in the early church, who, if he started telling lies and fabricating stories, would probably have called him out on it. We don't have evidence that people were calling Matthew out, saying what he came up with was false. We have absolutely zero evidence of that. And of course, Matt will also deny that the 4 early authors were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, of course, is the tax collector, like I mentioned. John was the fisherman, the beloved disciple. But then you have Mark. Mark is mentioned later in the New Testament as a friend of Peter, and it's called John Mark. And so John was given a lot of information by Peter. I'm sorry, Mark was given a lot of information by Peter. And then Luke, who traveled with Paul. And we see that all detailed when he starts writing in the first person towards the middle of the book of Acts. And so we have lots of people who are either eyewitnesses or they knew the eyewitnesses who would have certainly been called to account if they were weaving together falsehoods or making things up or embellishing or doing anything like that. Some people don't realize how important the fear of the Lord is. The fear of the Lord is not just the beginning of wisdom, but it is the beginning of wisdom. But the fear of the Lord also means that if I am entrusted by the Lord to write a book for the Lord, I'm not going to go fabricate stuff, inflating my ego and doing things that God would condemn me for. I'm not an idiot. Nobody would be an idiot back then. And I think that when you're an atheist and you're of this view that there is no truth out there, no absolute truth, that we're just cosmic blobs who are so lucky to be living on this planet. You don't see the reality behind these issues like this, because you don't understand what it means to believe the fear of the Lord. So here we go.
Well, you explore his document that he wrote carefully, checking such things as Greek manuscripts, checking such things as internal consistency, checking such things as archaeological support of the place names listed in the document.
Of the place names.
You go to other documents.
That's actually a really good point. The documents of the place names that were in there, people have referenced Luke as being a very good historian because of the way that he documented locations and how he would talk about going up, going down, doing things that only someone who lived in the area at the time would be able to know. The other thing that Dr. Peter Williams has pointed out is the fact that they found from early archaeological digs and that they've looked at the names that were very common in the New Testament. Like Mary was very common. Peter was very common. The names that were common were the kinds of names, or Joseph was common. So you see that when you have a common name, the name has to be distinguished. And I shouldn't say Peter was so common, it was Simon that I was thinking of. So Simon was distinguished by being Simon Peter. You have Mary. We always had to talk about which Mary because there were literally 6 Marys. So you have Joseph. It wasn't ever just Joseph. It was Joseph, the husband of Mary. And it was also Joseph, who was of Arimathea. Again, we have a very common name. So, and you think about how does that work? Like, what do you mean common names at a certain time? Well, if you go back and you look at the archaeological digs, you can find that the names that were very common in the New Testament were very common in the archaeological digs. And just to put a modern reference on this, I look at the United States, and when we talk about the top, say, 10, 15, 20 names in different time periods, when I was born many moons ago, very common names included Jennifer, Michael, Lisa, Sarah, Susan, who's in the chat or might be in the chat. Those were very common names, say in the 1960s, 1970s, and in the United States. And certainly in certain parts of the United States, they're perhaps more common than other parts. Well, that's the kind of specificity that Peter Williams has looked into. So again, offering further support for the authenticity of the New Testament. So here we go.
Archaeological evidence of the place names is corroborating evidence?
Yes.
So is the existence of New York corroborating evidence for Spider-Man?
No, but it is corroborating
Thanks.
evidence that I was born in New York City in 1954.
No.
Okay, this wasn't a very good argument, so I'm going to zoom ahead on that particular one. Let's get to the next.
Does that mean that what they say is true?
No, but it means you
That's
have an
my
accurate
point.
copy of Harry
That's
Potter.
my point. And your argument is the fact that we have many manuscripts that agree to an infinitesimal degree, which is not quite true, but they do
Yes, it
agree
is.
strongly.
Yes, it is. Very
Your
true.
your argument that you just made was that this is strong evidence that what they say is true. And that is simply fallacious,
That
as
is- you
demonstrated by your
misunderstood me.
own
I'm sorry, I
response just a moment
miscommunicated.
ago. I can't hear you.
My
I
pure
can't hear
point
you if I'm
was-
still talking.
Hold on.
So it gets a little bit testy in here, but I just wanted to again highlight some of the key points here. They're questioning the authenticity of the Bible. They dive down into the Gospels. The interesting thing is the Gospels were reconciled way, way back when in the 2nd century. There was an author who put all 4 Gospels together and was able to bring the whole story together and give you much more context. And I've done that too with the birth narratives. And that just, all that works is just read Luke first, then read Matthew. That's how those fit together like a glove. I've also done that with the empty tomb and when that was put together. And it was interesting because I was able to understand the way that Mary Magdalene went back and forth several times. And you wouldn't really get that if you just read the 4 Gospels separately. So they do fit together kind of like a puzzle or a glove, and it works out quite well. And it aligns with what archaeology has said, what geography has said, and more, and history, of course. And so everything aligns quite well. Now, in case you're wondering if we had hostile sources, because we haven't named those hostile sources, there were 9 hostile sources to Christianity within the first 150 years that also provide evidence for the validity or reliability of the New Testament. And included in those are people like Suetonius and Marabar Serapion and Josephus and Tacitus. And so there's a number of people like that who were non-Christians, but they helped to authenticate the validity of the Bible. And so I want to look at the chat here. I've got a few people I see. I want to say hi to. I see first one I see is Morlowin. Haven't seen Morlowin in a while, so good to see you. Zheng Fukusheng, haven't seen you in a while. I've got Craig here. Yeah, my sister's Jennifer, and I have brother Michael Craig. That's what I always remember those names. Very common names at the time. And so Nikki, also good to see you. Harry Stark. So Harry says historical fiction did not exist in the Roman Empire except romantic narratives, and New Testament contains contemporary characters and hence biography. Yeah, I would definitely say that it's a biography. The New Testament is not obviously, it's biographical history, and it gives us a lot of really good information. Also, hi to Susan. Susan knows that her name was also very common back in the day. And so my name is not a very common name. It's not the most common name, but I feel like I had a lot of friends named Stephanie way back when, but I don't see it quite as often now on the college campus. If I had to talk about the most common names, I've been noticing this lately, just so in case you guys are wondering, what are the common college names right now? I have in every class, I always have a lot of Nicks, N-I-C-K, Nick, and a lot of people named Ryan, males named Ryan. I have a lot of people with those names. I have a lot of females who have names like Madison, or I had a Chloe. I've got, what other names are really common? Let me think here. So I have to think about the students and their names. There's definitely a lot of, I'm forgetting some of the names. So there's, a lot of Josh. So we see a lot of Josh is a pretty common name. So Susan says her name was not common when you were born in the early 50s. Oh, okay. I feel like maybe it was the 60s then when I was thinking, or the 70s when I started seeing, because I have a lot of friends named Susan, Susan was a common name among my friends when I was in college. Actually, I had one of my best friends' name was Susan, but there were quite a few. And so anyway, so I'm digressing here. Let's zoom ahead a little bit and see what else we have. If anyone else, like Craig, you made a video. If you're interested in joining me on chatting about this, because you just made a video about Matt Dillahunty and how we really should not even be, with talking about the resurrection with somebody like Matt Dillahunty is pretty much an act of waste of time, because Matt will not. He doesn't, when you don't agree with the very premise that there's a possibility of a miracle, then of course, how can you argue for the resurrection, which is clearly a miracle? And so that makes it quite difficult. So I'm going to zoom ahead here just a little bit, see if we can get to a less tense portion of the debate. And so here we go.
Podcast. With that, we're going to jump into these questions, but also want to say,
I'm going to about what like the explanation was. It's like when people tell me, oh, I saw a demon or I was abducted by aliens or whatever, I'm always willing to believe that they are honestly trying to convey what happened or what they experienced or what they think happened. But that doesn't mean that I'm justified in accepting the conclusion they reached.
It's super interesting. You might want to note that in another debate that Matt was on, is either a debate or a conversation, but he said that his mother said she saw a demon. And I was thinking, now that is really interesting. His mother is, I think, a Baptist, if I understand correctly, who probably prays for him all the time. And one time I said to him in the chat on one of the debates he was in, that what if his mother's prayers start to work? So his reaction was to block me. I got immediately blocked. So I couldn't no longer interact with him. And so obviously he still sees my tweets. Somehow he found that one with the 5 generals apparently to be amusing, but it's actually, I think it's actually true. So, but as far as the aliens idea, that's also interesting is I've had Hugh Ross on my channel. Hugh Ross is an astronomer who's looked into various aspects surrounding the claims of aliens, the claims of unidentified flying objects, more specifically residual unidentified flying objects, because there's a lot of UFOs that can be explained naturally. And so naturally what we do when we hear about a UFO is we want to hear the best natural explanation. Now there's a few, very few, but a few that do defy natural explanations. And what Hugh Ross has pointed out, and I do find quite interesting, is a lot of times these ones that defy natural explanations, what they call residual UFOs, a lot of times those are these little, like I would say, probably demonic spirits who happen to show up always at the devil's time, which is right around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so in places where the occult is really big and practiced, and unfortunately in the United States, it's a growing concern. But places where the occult is practiced tend to be the places where people are claiming that they're having very unpleasant experiences with these alien beings. Now, as Hugh Ross has pointed out, it is physically impossible with the distances that we've been able to see and the characteristics of other planets that are relatively close to us, maybe 20,000 light years away. It's physically impossible for any carbon-based life form to skip across the universe and get to us, even if traveling at the speed of light. So, and it's just because it would not work. He's also talked about what Elon Musk would say. Elon Musk thinks he's going to colonize Mars. That's just not going to happen. Human beings have no way to be able to live on Mars with the atmospheric conditions there. But I digress. So the point is that, so what are these people experiencing? They claim that, in fact, some people have been killed by this, but they'll show up with scratch marks on them, all this kind of stuff, and they'll claim that they encountered aliens. And a lot of times they draw kind of similar pictures of what the aliens like. And the interesting thing about this whole thing is that what Hugh Ross thinks, he thinks that these are just demonic spirits. And it's just, you'll notice in the places like where he pointed out, he said they were having a lot of these appearances in the USSR. And of course, people were practicing the occult right around the time in that area when that was occurring. And so, yeah, so Nikki says, Matt's blocked me for suggesting that we should be open-minded and pursue truth with humility and without bias using the scientific method. Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's right. You know, Nikki, I did hear Michael Knowles talking about this. I forgot about that. And so, yeah, Michael Knowles also talked about these aliens. He thinks they're demons too. I think that one of the craziest things about Western society and what Harry Stark pointed out initially, in fact, Harry, I forgot to give you a wrench here. What a silly me. Here you're in my channel. And okay, so all right, so here we go. There. Okay, so the thing that also I just wanted to point out with the aliens, the demons, all that kind of stuff, is it's really relatively new, humanity-wise, that certain portions of people who live on the world claim that there isn't a spiritual warfare going on. Because if you go back and you look through history, obviously, people who live in India who endorse the Hindu faith do believe that there's spiritual wars going on. In fact, they've got many, many gods, thousands of gods, and their gods are representing both good and bad forces according to them. And some of their gods seem kind of similar, have some similar characteristics to the Trinity, the Blessed Holy Trinity of Christianity, but they fall short. And if you want details on that, see what Michael Heiser said in Psalm 82. His references to Psalm 82 in his book, The Unseen Realm. I won't get into details on that, but then you have other different belief systems, but all through history, everyone's always believed that there's this spiritual existence because it's very consistent with what we experience. It's been only recently, and starting in the German universities and places like that, and making its way, crawling into the West, all over the West, that people have denied the spiritual existence and claim that demons and Satan do not exist. And as Harry Stark has pointed out, that was probably, and I think it was also going back to one of the popes who said that one of Satan's greatest feats is convincing people that he does not exist. Now, the thing about when you're a Christian, you will probably encounter more of the spiritual world than when you are not a Christian, for the pure reason that that you're going to be fighting those forces, and you'll realize you're fighting these forces as a Christian. The forces don't want you to know they exist as an atheist because they feel like now they've got a legal hold on you to bring you down into the dark realm of hell. Now, I have found a lot of Christians have different views on hell, but my views are very consistent with what we find in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Hell is a place that's eternal. That's been confirmed by a whole bunch of saints, and even in visions at Fatima, this idea where Mother Mary opened up a vision to hell to the 3 kids at Fatima, and it was eternal. It's an existence that's pure terror. And according to some, the interesting thing some exorcists have said is that the demons were the ones who created the conditions of hell as we know them today, the fire and all that kind of stuff. Demons were the ones who did that. It wasn't something that God created, and I found that pretty fascinating. But I do believe in the idea of eternal conscious torment. And I know that some Christians don't. And I even know that I'm asking Josh Rasmussen to come on my channel. I'm in the middle of reading his book right now, which is this case that builds a reason for God. So I'm bringing Josh on my channel. It's my understanding he's a universalist. And so I don't have those views. I've had other universalists on my channel before, like Randall Rouser. So I'm always interested to open it up to people with contrary views, just to see where they stand and how they came to those views. And as I dive into his book, which I started reading this afternoon, I'm finding that his case that he's making is fascinating. He's he does a really good job writing. His writing style is really interesting. And so anyway, I digress. And so Harry says, Christopher Langan is regarded as the man with the highest IQ in the world, and he is a Christian, and he thinks the aliens are aliens. He was interviewed by Michael Knowles. Well, I guess how do you define an alien? An alien is obviously something that's non-human. And so I guess it depends on how we define it. And so, yeah, and Craig probably agrees. Nikki was picking raspberries. That sounds really like a fun thing to do, actually. My area, we can pick blueberries and strawberries. So anyway, anybody have any thoughts, questions, ideas, any comments on this that you want me to broadcast? Comments on if you happen to watch this debate here between Cliffe and Matt? Should I put a little bit more on? I think we will. Let's listen to a little bit more here. Start right here.
Do for Socrates. Okay, but whether or not Socrates existed is irrelevant. The only thing that I have to judge about Socrates are the words that are attributed to him. And so those concepts are what I'm evaluating. If it turns out that he was an invented fiction of somebody else, I still get to judge the concepts. Socrates' existence is irrelevant. And if I believe Socrates existed, and it turns out he didn't, the impact to my understanding of reality or my accuracy of reality is negligible. But Jesus's existence and his death and resurrection are the cornerstone of this. And if you were to accept that on the same grounds that you would, that Caesar Augustus lived or that George Washington lived, if you were willing to say, hey, I'm willing to accept George Washington existed, and I'm willing to accept that Jesus was slaughtered and rose again, and went on to ascend to heaven and serves as the kind of conduit for salvation for humanity. Now you're talking about a group of claims that are not remotely in the same category, which is why
he's got a point. So he does realize that there's a certain magnitude to believing whether or not Jesus exists. Now, the children at Fatima, just to open this up a little bit, but the children at Fatima back in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal, when Mary appeared to them and she made it clear that there was these 3 different outcomes. And many Christians believe similarly. In fact, C.S. Lewis, who is not a Catholic, but he also believes in this idea of something like a purgatory or a cleansing process. I believe that way even when I was a Baptist. I believe that there would be some kind of cleansing process for people like me, who I have gone and confessed many times now since I converted back. But even so, there's still going to be a cleansing process. I could not, in my current state, be put into heaven and be as perfect as I need to be in heaven. And so I do believe there's that. So what happened with the children at Fatima is Mary showed them, one of the kids, Lucia, she asked about the fate of one of her friends to Mother Mary who had passed. And Mother Mary said that she was going to be in purgatory until the judgment day. And there was the fate of other people, from what the saints say, that you can pray for and help to release them from purgatory to get to heaven. So purgatory is a temporary state, and that might be the state that some people think that everyone goes to. But there's also hell. And in July of 1917, Mother Mary opened up the window to what was hell, which was a permanent state. And as Sister Lucia pointed out, the people who were there in many cases thought like Matt thinks. They were people who didn't believe in God's existence and didn't believe in hell. And so that's not the outcome you want. So as Christians, what can we do about these people? Obviously, we don't want to see them. I would definitely do not want Matt or any of these other people that I've been interacting with for many years to go to hell. So I do say prayers for them. And I think that we should all say prayers for them. And I pray to God to open their eyes. And I am positive Matt's mom, I'm sorry, Matt, if I'm offending you, if you're listening to this, but I'm sure she probably prays every single day, practically every moment of the day, to try to get God to open your eyes. And but the thing is, you have to want to have your eyes opened. You have to be willing. Like, I'll look at people who are in this chat here. A Zheng Fukusheng, she says, religion destroyer. I think Zheng is a female. But if I'm mistaken, please let me know and correct me, Zheng. But I see people in the chat, and we're praying for you. We want you not to have that outcome. We want to make sure that you have a positive outcome and you end up in the best place possible. And the best place possible for a person who is in denial or suppressing the Lord, and you can see the words of suppression as mentioned and detailed in Romans 1. The world is very obvious to people, but you can suppress it. So if you're in that position, or even just a kind of segue here onto the woke mindset idea, I watched a couple videos this morning. I've been watching this James, and I'm forgetting his last name now, but he was on Jordan Peterson's channel, and I tweeted him. But he was talking, and I also listened to another channel with Peter Boghossian interviewing a woman who was of the woke mindset for many years. She said spent 20 years in the woke mindset, very much focused on racism, Marxism, the idea that racism is power and privilege based, and that people of color cannot be racist. It's impossible. That's part of the woke mindset. You can't be racist. But it's, as Boghossian and others have pointed out, the stuff that people come out for today in the woke mindset is really like Marxism. And if you just went back to Marx stuff and you took his class out and you replaced it with the word race, in many cases, they overlap quite distinctly, quite well. And so that's another problem. So Nikki, I'm sorry to hear about your dad. That's terrible. So very sorry. Everybody please pray for Nikki's family and everybody else, and for her dad's soul rest in peace and all that kind of good stuff. And so that's just something to make sure we pray for. So that's the thing. And so Jewish atheist, Jewish agnostic, Nikki knows for sure. Well, maybe her dad's eye, you never know in the very last moments of life if suddenly your eyes got opened. I always thought it was interesting if you guys ever watched or heard about what happened to Steve Jobs at his very last moments of life. It's like his eyes were open and he's like, oh my, and then he just went. And so he saw something that must have been pretty fascinating. And so, yeah, so just to segue really quickly in this woke idea and to what can happen is a lot of people, when they become atheists, they start leaning very far to the left. And the interesting thing is the opposite happened to me. When I became more Christian about 10, 12 years ago, I started moving from my liberal mindset to the right. And so now I would definitely call myself a conservative. I share many views with conservative people, even with people who are ultra conservative, like people like Ben Shapiro, who's an Orthodox Jew. I share many views with him on abortion, for example, but I'm digressing a little bit. But a lot of people, when you get into this view, you're an atheist, you start being a far liberal atheist in some case. Now, of course, we have exceptions. And so we have certainly some conservative atheists, people like Pine Creek Doug, but there's people who are, most of them tend to lean very far to the left. And you'll notice when they get into the woke mindset is they start having these opinions that all kind of go in lockstep, like opinions about racism and all those different movements that were going up a couple of years ago. And a lot of times their stuff flows with the culture. And so what people thought, say 10 years ago or 15 years ago about the LGBT movement is different from what people feel about it today. And just to kind of put a little bow on this presentation is it brings us back to what Father Ripperger said off the bat. Now that we're unfortunately under we've got many spiritual battles going on in this world. We're in a place right now when we really need to get down and pray and ask God to clean this all up. We've gotten into a culture that's sort of a big mess. Yeah, Douglas Murray's a good exception. And Nikki, your dad was a staunch conservative. Yeah, so somebody like a Ben Shapiro, who's a very conservative Jewish man, very conservative Jewish man. And so, and I think that's the other thing with God. God knows the hearts of people. And a lot of time people say, oh, well, what happens to the person who is maybe not worshiping Jesus or has never come around to worshiping Jesus? Well, God knows the hearts of them. And so the Jewish people that I know in my life, I very strongly believe that if they have looked and they honestly have made efforts and they decided to stay in their faith and do that kind of stuff, I think God will work with them. And so that's just what I think. And so, yeah, just like Ben Shapiro. So Ben Shapiro's another one that I think is probably one of God's, God loves him in many ways, and is probably at some point might even open his eyes to Jesus. I mean, he certainly puts all kinds of Christians in front of him. I don't know. I mean, come on, look at Ben Shapiro has interviewed William Lane Craig. He's interviewed John MacArthur, Bishop Barron. I mean, he keeps sitting down with these Christians and they keep throwing and even the one that was kind of Ravi Zacharias, who unfortunately has fallen out, but he's interviewed a bunch of different Christians, and the Christians keep hurling all these Jesus bombs and these Isaiah 53s at him, and it doesn't do anything. I don't know what's good, but that shows you, I think that shows you that if he wants, and if he prays, and if he really wants to find Jesus, his eyes will be opened and he'll find him. And so that's the thing. And so anyway, so everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. I hope you'll like and subscribe and come again. And with the vax, actually, I hate to say this on my channel because I don't know if I'll get probably punished in some way with the vaccine, but I keep seeing this interesting stuff with RFK and the vaccine, and I don't want to go too much down that rabbit hole because I honestly have not done nearly enough research to know exactly what's going on. But the stuff I'm seeing is interesting. And so what I've been trying to do is to get the studies that are coming out from the pharmaceutical companies to show how they, were they able to distinguish different groups. Now, one of my friends on Twitter showed me that, yes, they were able to distinguish deaths with people who had taken the vaccine and not had the vaccine. If they were unvaccinated, there was a higher percentage of them who were dying. But I was also curious in those groups what the controls were. Like, were they controlling for comorbidities? Were they controlling for age? I didn't see it in the one chart. Now, Rachel, my friend on Twitter, she indicated that it could be out there, and I'm sure it can. But I think that that's the kind of research that you want to do before you really say too much about the vaccine. So following the studies for almost 3 years. So Susan, if you want to come on my channel sometime and chat about it, Harry, Nikki, any of you guys, Zhang, if you guys want to come in here sometime, just let me know. If Craig's still here, I've had him on here. Susan, if you guys go and you do a search on my channel, look up Susan and on my channel, and you will find her revealing for the very first time on YouTube, I believe, the miracle that happened with her. So she was in hospice. You don't go to hospice when you're in really good shape. She was in awful shape in hospice. And all of a sudden she had a distinct feeling that God was going to cure her. And he did. And that was many years ago. And look at her now. She's here and everything's great. She watches He Ross all the time. And so, yeah, so that's so it's good. So yeah, splendid. Nikki was an atheist, a Jewish atheist, and she's come to Christ. And so I think probably by your example that you're because of your, I think that there's the idea, well, I'm not going to get too much into the speculations, but I do think a lot of times when you're around people who become Christians, a lot of times it opens, and especially if the person is a really good person. And like with Craig apparently was able to, I think it was his brother-in-law or something. He had people in his family who noticed the massive transition that he had. He had been using different drugs and stuff like that, I guess, way back when, like in his 20s or something like that. And he also started encountering Jesus and all of that kind of good stuff, turned around his whole life. I think he hasn't had any alcohol, any drugs in many years now. And so I guess his brother-in-law and other family members, when they saw his transition, some of them, I believe he said, some of them came to Christianity. So I think sometimes people look at you, and I think sometimes you don't realize that people are always watching you for your example. And when you try to show kindness as often as possible, that does probably speaks more volume to God than anything else that you can say. So it is do as I do. So, and his sister. So his sister also came to Christianity. So see, that kind of stuff. They just look at you and they say, wow, what is it? And it's probably like the 1 Peter 3:15. Give us a reason for your faith and tell us about it and all that kind of stuff. So you want to be a good representative for Jesus, live like Jesus, live like the saints. I always look at the saints now and realize that their example, their selfless sacrifices and everything else is something that we can emulate. And of course, we have the master, the first one, the pioneer. Jesus himself is somebody we should emulate. Oh, that's great. So, Susan, I'm going to go ahead and post this so we can take a look at that. I know the chat is going to go away for at least probably, I don't know, 10 hours before they post the chat. So at least now you guys, if you want to go in to see what Susan has posted on the coronavirus and all that kind of stuff, just go to that link that's there. So yeah, you can't, yeah. Craig, you could fake it maybe for a couple days, but no, not, what has it been, 30 years now or something like that? So faking it for 30 years, I don't think so. It's like, you can't fake personal transformation for 30 years. That's not, and plus people who've been around you a lot, who know you well, who know your ups, your downs, your flaws, your temper, all that kind of stuff. They see that stuff and they can say, wait a second, this is how you were. Now you're talking about going in prayer closets and here's how you are now. Clearly there's something that's going on. And I would say I've changed too since 2012, 2011. I gotten into a fight with family members. I do a big, long story, all this kind of stuff. And then I feel like I'm just this work in progress. I try to get closer and closer each year. And I've made a lot of mistakes, of course, and I still make mistakes, but again, I'm still working as well as you can. So yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Just looking at the examples of people. And so, yeah, Harry Stark says, let's crack the champagne. Destroyer says, Knechtle puts on this angry preacher act, but I'm convinced he's just in it for the money. I don't know. I don't know Knechtle very well. I've seen him and his son on different videos before. I always thought they were really calm. So this was one of the unique ones where he really did not like my tweet about the 5 generals of hell. He did not like that. But I wanted to be sure that everyone knew that when I did do that tweet, it wasn't my making it up. I got that from someone else. And so I played that just so you can see where I got it from and how it actually is quite consistent with what we see in the culture. So everybody, please have a good one. Please like, subscribe, and just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all in the glory of God. Thank you.